At 05:32 hours local time, at secret launch sites near Odessa, Ukrainian UAV crews began preparing for a strike on the Shcheskaris oil port, a target located 345 miles away in the city of Novorossiysk, in Russia's Krasnodar region. This was a critical Black Sea hub for receiving, storing, and pumping oil, where fuel was loaded into tankers, pipelines, and logistics networks serving Russian-controlled areas in the south. Within just 2 hours, that flow would be cut off. And ironically, the very oil Russia was trying to protect would become the fuel that ignited a massive sea of fire. At exactly 05:41 hours, local time, the first AN-196 Lutuyas began leaving the secret runway. The first drone raced into the darkness, accelerating to around 60 miles per hour, then quickly passing 120 miles per hour before lifting off the ground. Every 20 seconds, the remaining 27 Lutuyas launched one after another, banking southeast, looping around the central Black Sea, and heading straight towards Shcheskaris, where the oil tanks, pipelines, and piers were still operating at full capacity. About 1 mile from the launch point, the Ukrainian control crews immediately withdrew into the darkness, shutting off all lights and moving only with night vision equipment. They understood that within minutes, once Russia detected the unusual low-flying signals over the Black Sea, this area could become a target for retaliation. But Ukraine's SBS had anticipated that. They did not place the entire mission on a single launch site near Odessa. During the same time window, other launch waves also began from multiple secret positions around Mykolaiv, Dnipro, Kherson, and mobile routes along the Black Sea coast. In total, 160 unmanned aerial vehicles were sent into the air in a sequence calculated precisely down to the minute. But the most important part of the entire attack lay in the final operation named Fire Sea. This was the UAV group that left the launchers last, only after the other attack directions had already begun pulling Russian air defense attention in multiple directions. They had to fly farther from a safer position because this was the decisive strike aimed at the Shcheskaris oil port. To reach the target at the right moment, the UAVs in Fire Sea had to fly faster, nearly 120 miles per hour, even though that made them burn fuel more quickly. Meanwhile, the UAVs attacking closer targets maintained only 100 miles per hour. It was this reverse timing calculation that prevented the 160 UAVs from appearing separately and instead forced the Russian air defense system into an overload problem almost all at once. Immediately afterward, the entire oil infrastructure in the Krasnodar region entered a red alert state. Not only Shcheskaris, but also refineries, pumping stations, storage depots, and pipeline networks around the Black Sea could become the next target. Russian air defense commanders were immediately pushed into a dangerous problem. They did not know which direction was the real attack, which was the decoy, and which target had to be protected first. Only a few minutes after the launch waves began, Russian radar in the Armavir area detected the first signals. At first, they looked like small, slow, scattered dots on the screen, but then the number increased rapidly. The data was fed into the integrated air defense network and sent back to command posts across southern Russia, while in Novorossiysk, interception systems began calculating the flight path of each target. The problem was that Ukraine had not launched just a few individual UAVs. It had created too many approach directions at the same time. On paper, Russian air defense had S-400 systems, fighter aircraft, and interception layers far more powerful than a propeller-driven UAV. But in reality, that was exactly the trap. An S-400 missile could cost millions of dollars, and every hour of fighter operation also consumed a massive amount of money. Meanwhile, an AN-196 Lyuyi was far cheaper, but still capable of carrying a warhead weighing dozens of kilograms deep into Russian territory. From that moment on, every Russian choice became expensive. If they used modern missiles to shoot down cheap UAVs, they would be pulled into an asymmetric war of attrition. But if they hesitated, only a few drones getting through could set oil ports, fuel depots, and billion-dollar facilities on fire within minutes. That was the critical weakness Ukraine wanted to exploit, forcing Russia to pay a price no matter which option it chose. What made the AN-196 Lyuyi even more dangerous was that it did not depend entirely on GPS. This UAV could combine inertial navigation with a pre-programmed flight route, allowing it to continue moving toward the target even in a jammed environment. With a body more than 12 feet long, a wingspan of nearly 21 feet, a 150-pound warhead, and a range that could exceed 800 miles, the Ust-Luga did not need to be as expensive as a cruise missile to create a strategic effect, and that was what made the attack so frightening. Ukraine did not need to destroy Russia's entire air defense system. It only needed to overload it, force it to fire at too many targets at once, and allow the remaining UAVs to continue racing toward Shishkaras. By the time Russia realized that, Operation Fire Sea was no longer an ordinary UAV launch wave. It had become an attrition trap designed to open the way for the sea of fire ahead. By 05:57 hours, local time, the attack groups had merged into one large swarm, moving east at the same time. On Russian radar screens, 160 targets were appearing from multiple directions simultaneously. The question was whether they had enough capacity to stop the entire strike. And more importantly, which ones were decoys, and which one was the truly dangerous attack vector. By 06:37 hours local time, the Fire Sea formation had passed through the Kerch Strait area. The main UAV swarm continued moving southeast, heading toward Novorossiysk and the Krasnodar region. This was the decisive moment of the entire operation. Within that formation, 28 AN-196 Lyudius separated toward the Shishkaras oil port. Once they left the main swarm, if radar locked onto them at this moment, they would instantly become isolated targets and far easier to destroy. That was why the Ukrainian operators quickly moved the formation into a layered structure. At the highest flight layer were the E-300 Enterprise decoy UAVs carrying no warheads. They deliberately flew higher, exposing clearer signals on radar screens and forcing Russian long-range air defense systems to react. Their mission was not to destroy the target, but to pull radar attention, draw missiles, and make the enemy believe this was the main attack direction. At the middle flight layer were the FP-1 UAVs. They held a moderate altitude, continuing to pressure Buk M3, Tor M2 systems, and the tactical air defense batteries below. Their role was to prevent the Russian defensive network from having time to focus on a single point. Every additional signal appearing on radar meant another firing decision, another round consumed, and another defensive layer stretched wider. And at the lowest layer were the AN-196 Lyudius. They dropped to only a few hundred feet, hugged the terrain, and constantly changed altitude to blend into radar background clutter. At this altitude, their signals could easily mix with reflections from the ground, trees, buildings, vehicles, and the sea surface. Not only that, the curvature of the Earth also created a natural blind zone, allowing ground-based radar to see them only after the distance had already narrowed significantly. And that was what made this formation so dangerous. The E-300 Enterprises at high altitude forced the S-400 to look upward. The FP-1S in the middle layer pulled tactical firepower into an overload problem. Meanwhile, the 28 low-flying Lyudius continued slipping through the gaps forming between the interception layers, heading straight towards Shishkaras. Each altitude layer attacked a different defensive layer, and when Russia tried to react to all of them at once, its own air defense system began to stretch toward the breaking point. A missile climbing to strike a target at 12,000 feet cannot at the same time shoot down a UAV flying only 250 feet above the ground. That was the trap of the layered formation. From Krimsk Military Airfield, Su-30M fighters took off carrying radar powerful enough to track targets at a distance of more than 100 miles. But that very strength was pulled in the wrong direction. The N-001VE radar had been built to find clear targets in the sky, not small UAVs flying low at treetop level and blending into ground and sea clutter. The pilots quickly locked onto the E-300 Enterprise drones at high altitude. They were flying high, clearly visible, and most importantly, they carried no warheads. Their only mission was to pull Russian fighters upward. During the few minutes of hesitation needed to confirm those targets, the real formation below had already spread out across nearly 20 miles. The FP-1S in the middle layer continued drawing tactical firepower, while the 28 AN-196 Lyudius flew low at around 250 feet, hugging the terrain and pushing toward Shishkaras. The decoys worked exactly as planned. Russia looked upward, while the most dangerous strike vector slipped underneath. But ahead of Fire C, there was still an even more dangerous defensive layer.
Evacuate
The
immediately.
S-400
Code
Triumph
red.
battery on
All
Tuzla
personnel,
Island.
move to the
With
shelters
powerful
now.
radar, long-range
Incoming.
missiles,
Take cover.
and the ability to track dozens of targets at once, it was considered the steel wall guarding the gateway to Krasnodar. But Ukraine understood one thing very clearly: even that wall had a weakness. By 0645 hours, local time, the Fire C formation approached the Kavkaz port area, 110 miles from the Novorossiysk oil and gas cluster and the Shaskaris oil port. On Tuzla Island, the 91N6E Big Bird radar of the S-400 Triumph battery immediately began scanning for targets, while the 92N6E Gravestone fire control radar prepared to guide 4 8N6DM missiles. In theory, this was one of the most dangerous defensive layers on the approach route into Krasnodar, capable of detecting targets hundreds of miles away and tracking dozens of targets at the same time. But at that exact moment, Ukraine began activating the second trap. One E-300 Enterprise decoy UAV carrying no warhead was pushed up to an altitude of 12,000 feet, deliberately exposing a clear signal on the radar screen. The S-400 reacted almost immediately. A 4-8N6DM missile climbed upward, aiming straight at the target flying in the high layer. But that was not the real strike vector. While Russian radar was being pulled upward, the FP-1S in the middle layer continued applying pressure at several thousand feet, while the 28AN-196 Lutius below simultaneously dropped to only 50 feet, pressing close to the sea surface and the coastline. During those brief tens of seconds, the radar picture became chaotic. The high-altitude targets forced the S-400 to respond first. The signals in the middle layer pulled more tactical air defense systems into the fight. Meanwhile, the low-layer Lutius almost blended into the background clutter from the sea surface, terrain, port structures, and coastal roads. When the 91N6E scanned back down low, it no longer saw a clear formation, but only faint streaks, appearing and disappearing inside thick clutter. Fire C slipped through the first defensive layer, not through speed, but by making the enemy look in the wrong direction. But immediately afterward, the UAV swarm entered a quieter threat: Russia's electronic warfare zone, where Krasuka 4 began strongly jamming satellite signals, control links, and the spatial awareness of the entire formation. For several minutes, navigation data became almost useless. Signals were distorted, flight direction was pulled off course, and displayed positions no longer matched reality. But Ukraine had prepared for that situation in advance. The AN-196 Lutius switched to backup navigation mode, combining inertial guidance, magnetic compass input, and fixed infrastructure landmarks such as high-voltage power lines, pumping stations, pipelines, and industrial clusters along the Krasnodar-Novorossiysk axis. Those things could not be jammed, and they could not disappear from the ground. The route was still not perfect. Some UAVs were pulled off their expected heading as they passed through the strong jamming zone. A few others lost formation inside the morning haze. But the lead group still held the main flight path. At this point, only 12 drones from Fire C continued flying low, almost blending into the horizon, heading toward the industrial lights ahead. That was not only the final destination, it was the heart of the oil corridor Ukraine wanted to strike directly. By 0827 hours, local time, the industrial lights of the Shaskaris oil port appeared through the morning haze along the Black Sea coast. Ahead was no longer a single target, but an entire network of storage tanks, oil loading piers, high-pressure pipelines, and pumping stations connected directly to the Novorossiysk-Krasnodar energy corridor. But to reach the heart of that system, Fire C had to break through the final defensive layer. 6 Pantsir S-1 systems positioned in a protective ring around the port area. The remaining FP-1S immediately split formation, dividing into several small attack vectors and rushing in from different directions around the defensive ring at the same time. On their control screens, the Russian Pantsir S-1 crews were pushed into a situation that was almost impossible to handle completely. In theory, they could track multiple targets at once, but in reality, each system could guide only a limited number of missiles at the same time. To fire the next salvo, they had to wait for the radar to stabilize again, for the computer to classify new targets, and for the combat crew to lock on once more. That very process became the weakness. The first salvo of 57 E-6E missiles was launched almost simultaneously, tearing white streaks of fire across the pre-dawn sky. The FP-1S began maneuvering, but they had never been built to survive until the end. Their mission was to draw fire, forcing the Pantsir S-1 systems to spin their first reaction cycle on the more visible targets. And when fireballs began bursting across the sky, the gap Ukraine needed opened. Beneath that layer of chaos, the remaining 12 AN-196 Lyutias continued rushing low toward Sheskariz. They flew close to the ground and sea surface, now less than half a mile from the storage tank area. At that point, the Pantsir S-1 batteries were forced to switch to their 30mm 2 A38M cannons, spraying rounds into thick curtains of fire ahead of the UAV approach path. But at low altitude, among port structures, pipelines, oil tanks, and cranes, every shot became more dangerous. Some Lyutias were torn apart in midair. 2 others lost stability, drifted off course, and exploded at the edge of the port area. But several still punched through the fire net, closing in on Sheskariz at an altitude of only a few dozen feet. By then, the Russian crews had almost no way to lower their cannon angle any further without risking hits on the oil tanks and pipelines behind the targets. And that was the moment the most important defensive line protecting Sheskariz was breached. Pantsir S-1 was still firing, radar was still scanning, but Fire C had already entered the distance where every Russian decision had become too late. But the Russians still refused to give in. And just when it seemed the final defensive layer around Sheskariz had been torn open, they played their last card. At 0830 hours, local time, the 12 surviving AN-196 Lyutias had passed through the Pantsir S-1 fire ring, but at that exact moment, they entered the engagement zone of the 2 S-38 Derivatsiya PVO. This was not an old air defense system dragged out for temporary use. The 2 S-38 was a modern self-propelled anti-aircraft gun built to hunt low-flying targets such as UAVs, helicopters, and cruise missiles. It used a 57mm automatic cannon combined with electro-optical sensors, thermal imaging, and a digital fire control system. Against small, low-flying targets like the Lyuti, a single accurate burst could turn the approach path ahead into a dead zone. The 2 S-38 was positioned near the rear technical gate of the port, low, silent, and almost blending into the surrounding industrial structures. As the Lyutias rushed in at an altitude of only a few dozen feet, the turret immediately rotated to track them. The fire control computer calculated approach speed, dive angle, and lead point. This was no longer blocking fire based on volume like Pantsir. This was a precise 57mm cannon strike. The first burst detonated ahead of the leading UAV, creating a cloud of metal fragments directly in its flight path. The Lyuti banked sharply to evade, but it was already too late. The second correction burst tightened the pattern. A fragment cut into the fuselage, tore through the right wing, and destabilized the drone. Only a few seconds later, it rolled over and crashed at the edge of the port area, exploding in a small halo of fire. The second drone tried to drop even lower, descending to nearly 40 feet to slip beneath the firing angle. The 2 S-38's electro-optical sensor still held the track. The turret continued lowering the barrel. At less than half a mile, the computer had almost enough data for the next shot. With just one more firing cycle, that UAV could have been torn apart before it reached the storage tank area. But at that exact moment, the system fell into a difficult position. The target had dropped too low directly in front of the oil tanks, pipelines, and flammable equipment clusters of Sheskariz. If the 57mm cannon continued firing lower, one missed round or one falling fragment could easily hit the very facility it was trying to protect. The fire control system recognized that danger and was forced to limit the firing angle. The gunner could still see the target, the sensor still held locked, but the firing line had become too dangerous. In those few brief seconds, the 2 S-38 had to choose between continuing to fire and risking a strike into the oil infrastructure behind it. And that moment of hesitation opened the final gap. The remaining 8 Lyutias rushed through the dead zone, flying low over the ground and heading straight into the oil infrastructure inside Sheskariz. The final defensive layer was still operating, but Fire C had crossed the point where every Russian reaction had already become too late. At 0833 hours, local time, the first AN-196 Lyuti slammed directly into the central pipeline cluster of the Sheskariz oil port, This was a critical junction where oil from the storage tanks was pumped out to the pier for loading onto ships in the Black Sea. Inside the pipelines, pressure still held at around 420 pounds per square inches, while oil temperature in some heated sections reached up to 360 degrees Fahrenheit. When the warhead detonated, the valve cluster, flanges, and steel supports were torn apart almost instantly. Hot oil sprayed violently into the air, met the cold morning atmosphere, and formed a dense cloud of hydrocarbon vapor. Only seconds later, it ignited. A fireball erupted along the pipeline and then raced backward toward the pumping station. Emergency valves tried to shut, but many valve shafts had already been bent. Control cables had been severed, and the oil continued spraying out like a river of fire. 8 seconds later, the second Liuchi crashed into the storage tank area near the pier. The explosion punctured the tank wall where oil vapor had accumulated beneath the floating roof. Internal pressure surged. The tank roof, weighing dozens of tons, was blasted upward, twisted out of shape, and then collapsed onto the edge of the tank. Tens of thousands of barrels of oil spilled out, met the flames from the burning pipeline cluster, and turned the entire storage area into a sea of fire hundreds of feet wide. From there, the domino effect began. When the main pipeline was destroyed, pressure across the pumping network became unbalanced. Some sections still carried more than 300 pounds per square inches, while others suddenly lost pressure, causing flanges, joints, and check valves to fail one after another. In hot zones exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, steel lost its rigidity, supports sagged downward, and entire pipeline sections collapsed like a frame being snapped apart. The next Liuchi struck the oil loading pier. The explosion hit the loading arms, flexible hoses, and pressure pump cluster. Steel loading arms were blown off their swivel joints. Oil spilled across the concrete surface, flowed through technical channels, and carried fire deeper into the pier area. The temperature rose so quickly that the plastic insulation around electrical cables melted, while metal railings began glowing dark red inside the heat. Secondary explosions continued spreading across the storage zone. Shockwaves damaged more auxiliary pipelines, cable trays, control cabinets, and oil level sensors. The emergency water spray system became almost useless because water pressure had dropped sharply after the first explosions. Some nozzles produced only weak streams of water, which evaporated almost instantly when they reached areas hotter than 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At that point, Ust-Luga was no longer facing a single industrial fire. The entire pumping, storage, and oil loading network was collapsing in a chain reaction. When the pier was paralyzed, ships could no longer receive oil. When the central pipeline was destroyed, the flow from the storage tanks to the export zone was cut off. When the pumping station and control systems were burned out, the entire oil port was forced to stop operating. For Russia, this was not just damage to a rear area facility. Every day Ust-Luga remained offline meant more fuel trapped in the system, more ships unable to load cargo, more repair costs, and more pressure to pull air defense assets back to protect oil nodes in the rear. And for Ukraine, Fire C proved one thing very clearly. There was no need to destroy the entire energy network. By striking the right pipelines, piers, and key storage points, only a few UAVs could paralyze an entire oil corridor. If you found this analysis worth watching, hit like to support the channel, subscribe so you do not miss the next videos, and leave a comment telling us how you think the strike on Ust-Luga will force Russia to change the way it protects its rear areas. Goodbye!